cocky kid mocked an old veteran paying respect until the tomb guard spoke his name. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a crisp, quiet morning at Arlington National Cemetery, where the air was filled with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the hum of distant conversations. A veteran, wearing an old, faded suit, stood at the foot of the tomb of the unknown soldier. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of the memories that came rushing back as he stood before the marble marker. He was a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and yet he still showed up, every year, to honor his fallen comrades. He was an old man now, but the past lived in his eyes, in the slow, deliberate steps he took towards the memorial. As he approached, a young man, no more than 20, a Marine with his sharp, new uniform and a face full of arrogance, eyed the old veteran with a sneer. The Marine stood near the gates, crossing his arms in defiance. "You lost, Grandpa?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The old man didn't flinch. He simply kept his eyes focused on the memorial, his hand gently resting on the worn ribbon of a medal that hung from his neck. "I'm here to pay my respects," the old man said quietly, but with firm conviction. The young Marine laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that broke the silence of the cemetery. "Respect? For who? What are you even doing here?" The young man took a step closer, his gaze lingering on the old man, who remained calm, unmoving. He continued, "I think you got lost, old man. You should get going. You're not allowed to be here without proper clearance." The Marine's voice was laced with an arrogance that seemed out of place in such a hallowed ground. He gestured toward the entrance, his hands sweeping dismissively. The old man simply stood, his back straight, looking out at the tomb as if he had seen this moment 1,000 times. "I'm not lost," the old man replied softly. "I'm here for a friend, a general who deserves to be remembered." The Marine scoffed. "Sure, old-timer. And who exactly is this friend of yours? A general, huh? What's his name? And where's your clearance?" The old man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly reached up to adjust the faded pin on his chest, a small, unassuming piece of metal that told a story no one here could understand. As he touched the pin, something in the air shifted, and for a brief moment, the noise of the cemetery faded into the background. The Marine's voice seemed distant, like it was coming from another world. He didn't notice the shift. He only saw an old man, wearing a pin, one that looked like it had been through more than its fair share of battles. "What's this supposed to be, huh?" the Marine asked, flicking at the pin with a mocking grin. "You're a nobody. What, you think you're some kind of hero?" The old man stood silently, his gaze unwavering as the Marine continued to laugh. But then, just as the young Marine leaned forward, eager to get a rise out of the veteran, something happened. A figure appeared in the distance. A tomb guard, dressed in the immaculate uniform of the military honor guard, stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the pavement. The guard's posture was perfect, his eyes fixed ahead with the discipline of someone who had seen more than his fair share of respect and recognition. He walked steadily toward the Marine, whose arrogance faltered for a split second. The tomb guard's eyes never wavered as he stood at attention, his voice low but firm. "That man," the tomb guard began, his voice carrying across the cemetery, "is a hero, a true hero. You will show him the respect he deserves, or you will answer to me." The Marine's cocky grin faded, replaced by confusion. He was no longer the center of attention. The air around him seemed to freeze. The tomb guard's words had the power of command. He didn't need to say more. The young Marine, once so confident, was now a mere spectator in a moment much larger than himself. The old veteran, still silent, stood tall, a man of history who had earned his place in the sacred ground of Arlington. The Marine finally stood at attention, as the tomb guard turned and gave the old veteran a respectful salute. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. It was a moment of dignity restored, not just for the old man, but for every fallen soldier who had ever been forgotten in the passing years. The young Marine, now fully aware of the gravity of the moment, felt a deep sense of respect rise within him. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to honor the past. The young Marine, still standing at attention, could feel the weight of the tomb guard's words hanging in the air. His chest tightened as the realization of his earlier behavior sank in. He was no longer the center of attention, and the stillness of the cemetery seemed to amplify his internal discomfort. The old man, whom he had mocked just moments ago, remained a quiet figure, his back straight and unwavering, as if the passing years had made him immune to the cruelty of youth. The tomb guard, now standing at his side, gave a final glance toward the Marine before his gaze softened, turning toward the elderly veteran with a quiet reverence. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, as if the universe itself paused to honor the man standing before the tomb. The Marine stood frozen, his eyes now fixed on the old man in disbelief. What had he been thinking? How had he failed to see the quiet strength that radiated from the veteran's every movement? The tomb guard, his posture unyielding, slowly turned to face the young Marine once more. "This man, sir," he said, his voice calm but laced with an authority that commanded respect, "served his country in ways you will never understand. His presence here is not for your approval, but because he earned the right to stand before these hallowed grounds. The least you can do is give him the respect he deserves." The words struck the Marine harder than any physical blow could have. He stood there, speechless, feeling the sting of his own ignorance. The respect the veteran commanded wasn't something that could be earned with rank, medals, or a show of force. It was something deeper, something only those who had lived through the fires of battle and loss could truly understand. The Marine, still standing in place, tried to swallow the lump that had formed in his throat. The tomb guard nodded toward the old man, who gave a slight, knowing smile, the kind only those who had seen the hardest of times could offer. "You should go," the tomb guard added, his voice softer now. "And when you leave here, think about what it means to honor the fallen. Think about why you're here in the first place." The Marine nodded, his steps uncertain as he began to walk away. Each movement felt heavier than the last. The weight of his actions, the sting of his words, seemed to follow him with every step. As he passed the gates of the cemetery, the sound of the old man's quiet resolve seemed to echo in his mind. The tomb guard, with his unyielding presence, had spoken with such conviction that even the Marine, in all his youthful arrogance, could not help but listen. And as he left the grounds, he wondered if he would ever truly understand the depth of sacrifice that so many veterans had made. As the Marine disappeared from view, the old man remained standing by the tomb, his hands resting lightly on the worn ribbon of his medal. The quiet wind brushed past him, stirring the leaves around his feet. He had come here for a friend, and though the young Marine had mocked him, he had found something more important, the reminder that respect, true respect, is not something that can be demanded. It must be earned through actions, through sacrifice, and through a life lived with honor. And as the morning sun began to rise higher, casting a golden light over the cemetery, the old man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. His mission was complete. The fallen had been honored, and that was all that mattered. The old man stood still in front of the tomb, watching as the young Marine slowly disappeared beyond the gates of Arlington National Cemetery. He felt a strange sense of closure, knowing that his silent presence, his years of service, had left an impression on the young man, though the journey of understanding would be long. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and creating a soft, almost haunting sound around him. For a brief moment, it was as if the cemetery itself was whispering its own stories, its own memories, of those who had given their all for their country. The old man placed his hand gently on the tombstone, his fingers brushing the engraved names of the fallen. The familiar ache settled in his chest, the one that never fully went away, a reminder of the many battles fought and lives lost. His eyes scanned the names. Some of them he had known well. Others were just echoes from a past he could never forget. He didn't need to see the names to remember. The memories were etched in his mind, in his heart. As the sun climbed higher, a low hum in the distance caught his attention. It wasn't the usual noise of traffic or people. It was the unmistakable sound of a convoy, the rhythmic thrum of military vehicles moving with purpose. He didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. He had been in enough situations like this to understand the sequence. His time here was far from over. He had done his part by honoring the fallen, but there was still more to be done. The convoy, moving at a quick pace, soon pulled to a stop near the entrance to the cemetery. The vehicles were sleek and military-grade, their black paint reflecting the sunlight. The air seemed to thicken as soldiers dressed in immaculate uniforms stepped out. They were not just any soldiers. These were high-ranking officers, men and women who carried with them the weight of history and the responsibility of command. The old man didn't flinch. He knew these people. He had served with many of them. As they approached, the sound of their polished boots echoed on the gravel path. The air felt charged, and the atmosphere seemed to shift again, as if the very ground recognized the gravity of the moment. Among the officers was a familiar face, one he hadn't seen in many years, Colonel Harrison. The colonel had been a young officer when they had served together in the field, but now, his face was lined with experience, his eyes sharp and steady. He had risen through the ranks, becoming someone respected and feared. The colonel's gaze locked onto the old man the moment he stepped out of the vehicle. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were both taking a moment to absorb the years that had passed, the shared history that neither of them would ever forget. Finally, the colonel spoke, his voice low but carrying the authority that only comes from years of hard-earned respect. "Sergeant Major," he said, using the title the old man had earned but had long since left behind. "You're still here, huh? Still paying your respects?" The old man nodded slowly. His voice was steady but filled with the weight of experience. "You know I wouldn't be anywhere else," he replied quietly. The colonel looked at him for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. "I thought as much. You've been through hell, and you've seen it all. But there's something you don't know, something you haven't seen yet." The old man raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. Colonel Harrison stepped closer, his gaze now focused on the tomb, before he spoke again. "There's more to your story than even you realize," the colonel continued. "You might have been overlooked, even mocked, but today, you're going to be seen. You're going to get the recognition you deserve." The old man felt a strange flutter in his chest. Recognition? After all these years? It was a feeling he had long since put aside. He didn't need recognition. He had done his duty, and that was enough. But as he looked at the colonel, something in the man's eyes told him this wasn't about the past. It was about something larger. The colonel motioned toward the group of officers who had gathered around the tomb. He turned back to the old man and said, "We're not the only ones who have come to honor the fallen. There's someone else who's made a point to be here today." As he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Another officer, tall and imposing, stepped forward. The old man didn't need to be told who it was. He recognized the figure immediately, General Thompson. The general, with his 4 silver stars gleaming in the sunlight, walked toward them with a presence that commanded respect. His stride was purposeful, unwavering, and as he neared the old man, he paused for a moment. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The general's eyes locked onto the old man's, and without a word, he raised his right hand to his brow, executing a perfect salute. The gesture was sharp, precise, and full of respect. It was a salute that not only honored the man standing before him, but also the history they shared. The old man's heart skipped a beat as the general held the salute, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't just a gesture of respect. It was an acknowledgement of everything he had been, everything he had done, and everything he had lost. For the first time in years, the old man felt something deep inside stir. It was the recognition he had never expected, the kind that had eluded him for so long. And as he returned the salute, the weight of it all settled in. He had finally been seen. The general's salute lingered in the air, a moment suspended in time. The old man stood in place, his heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened settled into his chest. For so long, he had lived without recognition, without the fanfare that came with medals and accolades. He had never sought them. His reward had always been the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done his duty. But now, standing before the general, a 4-star officer, in the middle of Arlington, something had shifted. Something had changed. The general lowered his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving the old man's. The officers behind him, including Colonel Harrison, stood silent, their eyes averted in respect. The old man felt the weight of the moment, a deep, unspoken understanding passing between him and the general. "You've earned every ounce of this," General Thompson said, his voice low but resonant. I'm sorry it took so long for the rest of us to realize it. The old man nodded, his throat tightening. He had spent so many years in the shadows, waiting for a moment like this, and now that it was here, it felt overwhelming. The general, without breaking his gaze, took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. But this isn't just about you, he continued. This is about everyone who's ever stood beside you, fought beside you. They are why you're here today. The old man's eyes flickered, a brief flash of emotion crossing his weathered face. He knew exactly who the general was referring to, his fallen comrades, the ones who never made it back. They had given everything, and he had survived. He had lived to honor them. The general's words struck a chord deep within him, and for a moment, the cemetery around them seemed to fade into the background. There were no more guards, no more mockery, no more doubts. It was just him and his brothers in arms, standing together in spirit. He swallowed hard, gathering himself, then spoke for the first time since the general's salute. I've always honored them, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I've never been alone. They're still with me, every day. General Thompson nodded, his expression softening. I know. And now the rest of the world knows, too. He turned to his officers, giving them a single, sharp nod. The officers stepped forward, one by one, their movements precise and deliberate. The air was thick with a sense of reverence as they surrounded the old man. The general raised his hand again, this time to address the small gathering. For those of you who don't know, he began, his voice carrying across the cemetery. This is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. He served with distinction in multiple campaigns, his leadership unparalleled. He is one of the few men who can truly say he has seen it all. But more than that, he is a symbol of the spirit that has carried this nation through the darkest days. A spirit that cannot be broken. The officers stood silent, heads bowed in respect, and the old man's heart swelled with pride. He hadn't needed the recognition, but hearing it now, from the highest of ranks, filled him with a sense of purpose. This was why he had come to the cemetery, to honor the fallen, yes, but also to remind the living that the price of freedom was high, and it had to be remembered. General Thompson continued, Sergeant Major Kelly didn't just fight for his country, he fought for his comrades. He saved countless lives in the heat of battle. And today, he stands here to remind us all of the debt we owe to those who serve. The general paused, his gaze shifting to the old man. It's an honor to stand in your presence, sir. The old man was speechless, the weight of the general's words sinking in. This wasn't just a ceremony. This was a recognition of a lifetime of service, of sacrifices made and promises kept. For the first time in years, he felt the burden of his past become something other than a weight to carry. It was a badge of honor. As the general stepped back, the officers began to move, and the old man stood alone once more, but not in the same way as before. This time, he was not invisible. This time, he was seen. The silence of the cemetery was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful calm. The old man turned his eyes back to the tombstone, his comrades' names etched in stone. He closed his eyes for a moment, offering a quiet prayer. He had fought for them. He had lived for them. And now, in this moment, he knew they would never be forgotten. The wind picked up once more, rustling the leaves, and for a fleeting moment, the old man could almost hear the voices of the fallen, carried on the breeze. Thank you, he whispered softly, the words meant for no one but them. But it didn't matter. He had done what he came to do. He had honored the fallen. And in that moment, that was enough. The morning sun was high in the sky now, casting long shadows across the cemetery as the crowd began to disperse. The old man stood alone near the tomb, the weight of the past still heavy in his heart, but now mixed with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The general's words, the salute, the recognition, everything had culminated in this moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't just a forgotten relic of the past. He was seen. He was respected. And for that, he was grateful. The breeze stirred the leaves at his feet, and for a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, taking in the quiet stillness. He hadn't come here for the recognition, but he couldn't deny the warmth it had brought him. He had lived his life for others, for the men he had fought beside, for the soldiers who had never made it back. Today, for a brief moment, he had been able to stand before them, to honor them, and in turn, he had been honored as well. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, A familiar voice broke through the silence. "You okay, Sergeant Major?" The old man turned to find Colonel Harrison approaching, a look of concern on his face. The old man smiled slightly, his weathered face softening. "I'm good, Colonel. Just taking it all in." Colonel Harrison nodded, glancing over his shoulder at the departing officers. "I know it's been a long time coming. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. We all are." The old man gave a small chuckle. "I don't need your pride, Colonel. I've earned my peace." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Maybe so, but I think it's about time the rest of the world knows what we've known all along. You've earned more than just your peace." The old man didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the tombstone, his fingers tracing the engraved names of the men he had served with. His thoughts drifted once again to the battlefield, the endless days, the noise, the confusion, the fear. But there was also something else, something he hadn't thought about in years, the camaraderie, the brotherhood. The moments where, despite the chaos, he had known that he wasn't alone. He'd always believed that in the end, that was what mattered most. Knowing that someone had your back, that you were part of something bigger than yourself. That, he realized, was the true reward of service. Not medals, not recognition, but the unbreakable bond formed in the heat of battle. Colonel Harrison watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You know, we've all got our stories," the colonel said. "But yours, it's different. You've been through hell and back. You didn't need anyone's permission to be here today. You did it because it's who you are." The old man didn't respond, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes. "And now," the colonel continued, "we all know who you are, and we're going to make sure no one forgets it." The old man looked at the colonel, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't need to be remembered," he said softly. "The men I fought with, they're the ones who deserve to be remembered. They're the ones who never came back." The colonel's expression softened. "But you're here, and that's why we can't forget. You're their legacy, Sergeant Major." The old man turned back to the tombstone, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I guess that's all I really need." As the colonel stepped back, the old man stood there for a long moment, lost in thought. He could still hear the faint echoes of the battles fought, the screams of his comrades, the silence of those who had fallen. But now, there was something new in the air, something that had been missing for so long. Respect. For the first time in years, he felt it. Not from the world, but from within himself. He had fought for the right reasons. He had fought for his brothers, for his country, and for the ideals that had carried him through the darkest times. And now, as the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the cemetery, he could finally let go of the burden he had carried for so long. The world had recognized him, and in that moment, he was content. As the old man stood by the tombstone, his hand resting lightly on the cool stone, he could feel the weight of the years pressing against him. The recognition, the salute from the general, and the words of respect, it had all come so suddenly, so unexpectedly. He had never asked for it. He had never needed it. But now that it had come, he felt something stir within him. The journey he had taken over the years, through the battles, the losses, and the silent moments of remembrance, had brought him to this point. It was a point of resolution, of peace. He looked out over the cemetery, the rows of white tombstones stretching out before him like the silent testimony of countless soldiers who had given everything for their country. They were his brothers and sisters in arms, the ones who had fought beside him, the ones who had fallen in the heat of battle. He could still hear their voices, their laughter, their cries for help. But now, their voices were silent, and only the wind whispered their names. The old man closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. In that moment, he felt their presence around him, a comforting reminder that he was never truly alone. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a deep sense of gratitude, not for the recognition he had received, but for the men and women who had shared the burden of war with him. He had carried their memories for so long, but now, they were carrying him. The colonel, who had remained nearby, watched the old man with quiet understanding. He knew that this was the moment when the weight of the past would finally lift. The old man had never sought fame or recognition. He had never wanted to be the center of attention. He had simply wanted to honor those who had come before him. And now, he had done just that. "You know, Sergeant Major," the colonel said, his voice soft, "there's one thing I've always admired about you. You never needed anyone's approval. You've always done what was right, even when no one was watching." The old man turned to face the colonel, a small, weary smile on his lips. "I didn't do it for approval," he replied quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The colonel nodded, his eyes filled with respect. "That's why you're here today? That's why we're all here." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the rows of graves. He could hear the distant hum of a plane overhead, the sound of life continuing on, moving forward. The world had changed, but the memories remained the same. "I didn't do it for recognition," the old man said softly, "but I'll take it. For them. For the ones who didn't make it back." The colonel stepped closer, placing a hand gently on the old man's shoulder. "They won't ever be forgotten. Not as long as you're here to tell their story." The old man's eyes flickered with emotion, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The moment spoke for itself. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery, the old man and the colonel stood side by side, silently honoring the fallen. The silence was profound, but not heavy. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people who understand each other's pain and sacrifice stand together, knowing that the memories of those they've lost will never fade. They stood there for what felt like hours, not speaking, but sharing a bond that words could never fully capture. It was the bond of veterans, those who had fought, those who had survived, and those who had fallen. Finally, as the sun began to set, the old man turned to the colonel. "I think it's time to go," he said quietly. The colonel nodded. "Yes, sir. It's time." Together, they walked away from the tombstone, leaving the cemetery behind. But the old man knew that as long as he lived, the memories of his brothers and sisters in arms would never be forgotten. They would live on in the stories he told, in the moments of silence he shared with those who truly understood. And most importantly, they would live on in the respect and honor they had earned. For the first time in a long while, the old man felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't about the medals, the recognition, or the salute. It was about the sacrifices that had been made and the promise that those sacrifices would never be forgotten. As the colonel and the old man left the cemetery, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of those who had come before, their names etched in the stones of history. And the old man, at long last, could finally let go of the burden he had carried for so many years. The old man and the colonel walked in silence as they left the cemetery behind. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in a warm, golden glow, but the old man could feel the weight of the years still pressing on his shoulders. The recognition, the honor, it had been a long time coming, but it felt different now. There was peace in his heart, a peace that had eluded him for so long. But even as the world around him seemed to settle into calm, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this day, more to this journey, than he had realized. As they walked, the colonel glanced at the old man, sensing the unspoken thoughts running through his mind. "You okay, Sergeant Major?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence. The old man nodded, his gaze focused ahead. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady but tired. "Just thinking about all those who never made it back." The colonel didn't respond right away, but he could see the heaviness in the old man's eyes, the weight of loss that had never truly left him. "You've done your part," the colonel said finally. "You've honored them. That's what matters." The old man sighed softly, his steps slow as he continued to walk beside the colonel. "I know," he said quietly, "but it never feels like enough. Not when I think about all the faces, all the names, the ones who never got to walk away." The colonel said nothing, but his expression softened. He had seen the old man struggle for years, seen the way he carried the burden of his past like a soldier never quite able to lay down his arms. But today, the weight had lifted, if only a little. It was enough to know that the respect, the recognition, had finally come. As they reached the car, the colonel paused, turning to face the old man. "There's something I need to ask you," the colonel said, his voice serious. The old man raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What's that?" he asked. The colonel hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, his voice low. "You've carried this burden for so long, Sergeant Major. But have you ever thought about telling your story? About sharing what you went through, what you saw?" The old man was silent for a long moment, the question hanging in the air. He hadn't thought about it. He had always kept his past to himself, believing it was something best left unspoken. But as the years went by, the faces of the men he had lost, the comrades who had fought beside him, began to fade from the memories of those who remained. He had never wanted to be the one to speak of it. But maybe, just maybe, it was time. I don't know, the old man finally said, his voice quiet. It's not something I've ever wanted to revisit. But maybe it's time. The colonel nodded, as if he had expected that answer. It's up to you, he said, but your story is one that needs to be told. Not for you, but for them. For those who never had the chance to speak. The old man looked out at the horizon, his mind swirling with thoughts. The men he had fought with, the ones who had fallen, the battles that had shaped him. How could he put it all into words? How could he ever make someone else understand the weight of it all? The colonel placed a hand on his shoulder, breaking him from his thoughts. You don't have to do it right away, he said. But know that the world needs to hear it. And when you're ready, I'll be here to help you share it. The old man looked at the colonel, the weight of his words sinking in. He had spent so many years in silence, bearing the memories of war alone. But now, with the colonel standing beside him, it didn't feel so impossible. Maybe telling his story wasn't about reliving the pain. Maybe it was about making sure the ones who had given everything were never forgotten. I'll think about it, the old man said quietly, his voice steady. But not today. Today is for them. Today is for remembering them. The colonel smiled, giving him a nod. I understand. As they climbed into the car, the old man sat back, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The day had brought more than just recognition. It had brought clarity. The journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. He had a purpose beyond the past. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to share it. The car pulled away from the cemetery, the rows of tombstones fading into the distance. But the old man knew that the stories of those who had fallen, the ones who had never been forgotten, would live on in him. And when the time came, he would tell their story. Not for himself, but for them. The car hummed softly as it drove down the quiet streets, the weight of the day still lingering in the air. The old man sat in the passenger seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The events of the day, the salute, the words of respect, the recognition, had left him feeling a mix of pride and unease. It wasn't the first time he had been recognized for his service, but there was something different about today. It felt final, like the culmination of a journey that had taken far longer than it should have. Colonel Harrison glanced at him from the driver's seat, sensing the quiet reflection in the old man. You okay? He asked, his voice gentle. The old man nodded, though his mind was far from the car or the road ahead. Yeah, he replied softly. Just thinking about everything. It's hard to believe it's all over. The colonel remained silent for a moment, allowing the old man his thoughts. He knew that after a lifetime of service, it would take time for the old man to process everything. I know it's a lot to take in, the colonel said, breaking the silence. But I'm glad we're doing this now. You've earned it. The old man turned his gaze toward the window, watching the familiar sights pass by as they neared the town. Maybe, he said quietly, but it doesn't feel like enough. I've done so much, lost so much. And all these years, I've been carrying it all. Maybe it's time to let go. The colonel nodded again, his eyes fixed on the road. It's not easy, he said, but you can't carry it forever. It's okay to let it go. It's okay to be proud of what you've done. The old man's gaze drifted to the cemetery they had just left. The rows of white gravestones, standing in perfect formation, each one a silent testament to lives lost. He felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of pride and sadness. He had seen too many of those graves. Too many names etched in stone that would never be spoken aloud again. I'll never forget them, he said quietly, almost to himself. Not the ones who fell beside me. Not the ones who never came home. The colonel glanced at him, his expression softening. You never will, he said. And that's why you're here today. That's why you earned this recognition. You kept their memory alive. You honored them, even when no one else did. The old man nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I don't know if I ever really did enough for them. I don't know if any of us did. We did our duty, but it never feels like enough. The colonel gave him a reassuring smile. You did what you could. That's all anyone can ask. You've carried them in your heart, and that's more than enough. The old man remained silent for a long while, his thoughts drifting back to the battlefields, to the men he had lost. There were days when he thought about them constantly, their faces never far from his mind. He had tried to live a life that would make them proud, to honor their sacrifice in everything he did. But there were still moments, quiet moments like this one, when the weight of their loss seemed unbearable. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" he asked, his voice low. "The fighting, the sacrifices, the years of pain. Do you ever wonder if it was all worth it?" The colonel paused for a moment before answering, his voice steady. "I think about it all the time," he said quietly. "We do what we do because it's our duty, because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. But at the end of the day, we all wonder what it was for, what the point of it all was. But the answer is always the same." The old man turned to look at him, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "And what's that?" he asked. The colonel met his gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "It was worth it because we're here. We're here to carry on their memory, to make sure they're never forgotten. And that's the greatest honor we can give them." The old man nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had always believed that. He had always known that the greatest tribute to those who had fallen was to live with honor, to carry their legacy forward. And now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing just that. As the car pulled into a quiet parking lot, the old man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past slowly begin to lift. He had served his country. He had served his comrades. And now, with the colonel by his side, he could finally let go of the burden he had carried for so long. The journey was not over, but the road ahead felt a little bit lighter. "Thank you," the old man said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For being here. For helping me carry this." The colonel gave him a reassuring smile. "Anytime, Sergeant Major. Anytime." Together, they stepped out of the car, ready to face whatever came next. The past was still there, still waiting to be remembered, but the future was theirs to shape. And for the first time in a long time, the old man felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. He was ready to share his story, not just for himself, but for those who had fallen, and for the ones who would follow in their footsteps. The old man sat quietly in the small room, the soft glow of the evening sun filtering through the window. He had returned to his modest home after the day's events, his mind still racing with the memories of the cemetery, the recognition, and the quiet understanding that had passed between him and Colonel Harrison. For so many years, he had kept his story to himself, tucked away in the recesses of his mind, a secret he didn't think the world was ready to hear. But now, as the evening wore on and the weight of the day's events settled into his bones, he felt an undeniable pull, an urge to finally share his story. The colonel's words echoed in his mind. "Your story needs to be told." The old man had heard that sentiment many times over the years, but it had always fallen on deaf ears, his own included. What could he say that would make any difference? What could he share that hadn't already been said? But now, as he sat in the quiet of his home, something inside him shifted. Maybe it wasn't about making a difference. Maybe it wasn't about telling his story for the world. Maybe it was simply about telling it for them, for the men he had lost, for the brothers in arms who had never made it back. He stood up slowly, his body aching from the years of wear and tear. The war, the battles, the losses, they had taken their toll on him, physically and emotionally. But the pain wasn't something he could escape. It had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his being. He walked over to a small table in the corner of the room, where a leather-bound notebook sat. He hadn't opened it in years. It was filled with notes, scribbles, and thoughts he had put to paper during his time in the service. Moments of clarity, moments of fear, moments of brotherhood. He picked it up and opened it to a random page, his eyes scanning the words he had written so many years ago. The words were as sharp as ever, each one a reflection of the person he had been then. The soldier, the leader, the man who had fought to survive. But now, as he read those words, they didn't feel like his own. They felt like the words of a stranger, someone he had long since left behind. He closed the notebook and set it back on the table. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that it wasn't in those old pages. He had to find it somewhere else. He walked over to the window and looked out into the quiet streets. The world outside seemed unchanged, as though nothing had shifted. But inside, he felt different. He was different. The recognition, the salute, the words that had been spoken to him, they had changed something in him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He wasn't just the old man who sat quietly in his home, lost in the memories of a past long gone. He was more than that now. He was someone who had earned his place in the world, someone who had a story to tell. And so, as the sun set on that quiet evening, the old man made a decision. He would tell his story, Not for recognition, not for accolades, but because it was time. Time to share the memories of those who had fallen, time to honor them in a way that would keep their spirits alive. He didn't know how he would do it, or where to begin, but he knew one thing for sure. He would start here, with the memories he had carried for so long. And as he sat back down in his chair, the weight of the past felt a little bit lighter. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing, not just for him, but for all those who had shared in the journey. He picked up the notebook again, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened to the first page. He wasn't sure where the words would take him, but he was ready to follow, ready to speak the words that had been buried for so long, ready to finally let his story be heard. And in that moment, the old man felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. A glimmer of something new, something bright. Maybe it was the beginning of a new chapter, or maybe it was the end of an old one. Either way, he was ready to turn the page. The old man sat at his desk, the notebook resting in front of him. The quiet of the room seemed to wrap around him, almost as if the world itself had paused, waiting for him to begin. He hadn't touched the notebook in days, unsure of how to start. But now, with the weight of his decision behind him, he felt a strange sense of calm. It was time. He had carried these stories with him for so long, and now, finally, it was time to set them free. He picked up the pen, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the notebook. The paper felt different somehow, almost sacred in its silence. He took a deep breath, then began to write. His handwriting, though shaky from age, still held the same steady rhythm it had all those years ago when he had first written in the field. The words started slowly, as if they were hesitant to leave his mind. But as they flowed onto the paper, they began to gain momentum. The first memory he wrote down was one of the hardest, the first time he had seen a friend fall in battle. He wrote about the feeling of helplessness, the way time seemed to slow as the world around him went silent, and how he had watched in shock as his comrade took his final breath. He wrote about the guilt that had consumed him in the aftermath, the feeling that he should have done something, anything, to prevent it. But as the ink filled the page, he began to understand. He couldn't save everyone. He could only do his best, and that was all anyone could ask of him. As the days passed, the old man continued to write. Each story was a new weight lifted from his shoulders. He wrote about the battles, the fear, the camaraderie, and the moments of quiet strength that had kept him going. He wrote about the faces of those he had lost, their names still vivid in his mind, their voices still echoing in his heart. He wrote about the times when he had felt proud to serve, when he had seen the impact of his actions on those around him, and how, in those moments, he had known he was part of something bigger than himself. The more he wrote, the more he realized that his journey was not just about the pain, the losses, and the sacrifices. It was also about the lessons he had learned, the strength he had found in the darkest of times, and the legacy he would leave behind. By the time he finished writing, the notebook was filled with stories of brotherhood, of survival, and of honor. Each page was a tribute to the men and women he had fought beside, and to the soldiers who had fallen long before him. The old man leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling as he closed the notebook. He felt a strange sense of peace wash over him, as if the act of writing had lifted a burden he hadn't even realized he was still carrying. He had shared his story, not just for himself, but for all those who had never had the chance to tell theirs. He had honored them in a way he had never thought possible. As he sat there in the quiet room, the weight of the past didn't feel as heavy anymore. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer something that controlled him. It was a part of him, yes, but it didn't define him. He had done his duty, not just as a soldier, but as a man. And now, with his story on paper, he could finally rest. The old man stood up slowly, his body aching from the years of service and sacrifice. But there was a new lightness in his step, a sense of resolution he hadn't known before. He walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The world had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The faces of the past had begun to fade, but their memories, their sacrifices, would never be forgotten. And now, his own story would live on, passed down to others who would carry it forward. For the first time in a long while, the old man smiled, feeling the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. He had done what he came here to do. He had honored the fallen. And in doing so, he had found a kind of peace. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the world outside, the old man felt ready. ready for whatever came next. His journey was not over, but he was no longer burdened by the past. It was time to move forward, to embrace the future with the same courage and honor that had carried him through the darkest times. And for the first time in years, the old man felt at peace with the world. He had lived a life worth living, and his story would carry on long after he was gone. The old man sat back down at his desk, the notebook now closed in front of him. He had written his story, and though the weight of it still hung in the air, there was something different now. The burden was no longer overwhelming. It was as if, by putting his experiences into words, he had allowed himself the freedom he had been denied for so long. But there was still something left to do. The old man knew that he couldn't just leave it at this. His journey, his life, his story, it wasn't just for him. It was for them. For the men he had lost, for the ones who never had the chance to speak. It was time to share his story with the world. The thought of speaking publicly about his experiences made him uneasy. He had never been one for the spotlight, never one to seek out attention. But he knew that his silence had come at a cost. The world had changed, and with it, the way people viewed those who had served. Many had forgotten what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. Many had lost touch with the true cost of freedom. But he could change that. He could make sure the sacrifices of his comrades were never forgotten. The old man stood up, walking over to the window once more. The street outside was quiet, peaceful. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he had seen in the field, the chaos that still echoed in his mind. But that's what made it all worth it. The peace that came with freedom, the peace that he and so many others had fought to protect. He turned away from the window, a new sense of purpose settling into his chest. He was ready. It was time to share his story. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he had been given, the number that would start the process of telling his story to the world. He had hesitated for so long, but now, there was no more doubt. He had a responsibility. He had a duty to make sure his comrades were remembered. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Hello. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional. Is this the producer for the Veterans Voice Project? He asked. Yes, it is, she replied. How can I help you? The old man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle deeper. I'm ready to share my story, he said, his voice steady. I think it's time. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure? She asked gently. It's a big step. You don't have to do this if you're not ready. The old man nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'm ready, he said. I've kept it to myself for too long. But it's time for the world to hear it. For my brothers to be remembered. We'll get you on the schedule, she said warmly. And we'll make sure your story is told the right way. You'll have our full support. He thanked her and hung up the phone, feeling a sense of finality wash over him. It was done. He had made the call. Now, all that was left was to speak. As he walked back to the desk, he couldn't help but think of the men who had fought beside him. The ones who never made it back. They were the reason he was doing this. They were the reason he had lived all these years with the weight of their sacrifice pressing on him. And now, finally, their memory would live on. He opened the notebook again, flipping through the pages he had written. The words were still there, still fresh in his mind. But now, they felt different. Now, they were part of something bigger. His story, their story, would live on long after he was gone. As the old man sat back in his chair, the evening light faded into dusk. The world outside seemed quiet, peaceful. But inside, the old man knew that the battle for memory, for honor, was just beginning. He had lived his life with purpose, and now, he would make sure that purpose would not fade with time. His story, the story of all the men and women who had given everything for their country, would be heard. And in that, he found the peace he had been searching for all these years. The day arrived for the old man to share his story, and as he sat in the quiet room, the weight of the moment settled in. He had prepared for this, written his thoughts down, and spent countless hours reflecting on the past. But now, as he stood before the microphone, ready to speak, he felt the familiar tension in his chest, the same tension he had felt before every major battle, before every moment when his life had been on the line. This was different, though. This wasn't a fight for survival. It was a fight for memory, for honor, and for the men who had fallen beside him. The room was small, tucked away in a quiet part of the building. It was simple, unassuming, but it felt right. He sat in a worn leather chair, the microphone before him, a camera off to the side. Across from him, the producer, a young woman with a warm smile, adjusted the camera, and gave him a reassuring nod. "Whenever you're ready," she said softly, her voice kind but professional. The old man took a deep breath, feeling the years press down on his shoulders once more. He had carried this weight for so long, but now, it was time to let it go. He cleared his throat, looked at the microphone, and began. "My name is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. I served in the United States Army, and I've seen things that no man should have to see." His voice was steady, but there was a certain weight to it, as though each word carried the memory of 100 battles. "I was there at the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, one of the coldest and most brutal battles I've ever fought in. It was -40 degrees, and we were surrounded. The enemy outnumbered us by 10 to 1, but we held that line. We held it because we had to. We held it because the men beside us depended on it." The old man paused, his eyes drifting to the side as memories flooded back. The faces of the men who had fought with him, the sounds of gunfire, the smell of blood and smoke, all of it came rushing back. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before continuing. "I remember one moment, clear as day. I was crouched behind a rock, trying to get a good shot, when I heard someone scream. It was one of my men, and he was pinned down by enemy fire. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my rifle and ran toward him, dodging bullets, praying to God that I didn't get hit. But I didn't think. I just acted. Because that's what you do when you're a soldier. You protect your own. You don't stop to think about it. You just do it." The old man's voice caught for a moment, and he cleared his throat again. "I got to him, pulled him out, and we made it back to safety. But I lost a lot of good men that day. And that's something you never forget. You carry it with you, day in and day out. The faces of the men you couldn't save. The ones who never made it home." He paused again, looking down at his hands, the gnarled fingers that had once held a rifle so tightly. "I've spent a lot of years thinking about that, wondering if I could have done more, if I could have saved them all. But the truth is, you can't save everyone. You do what you can, and you hope it's enough. That's what it means to serve. To give everything, knowing that it might not be enough." The producer sat quietly, watching him, but she could see the emotions that flickered across his face. She had heard stories like this before, but never from someone who had lived through it. The weight of his words, the years of experience they carried, was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. The old man continued, his voice softer now. "After that battle, I came home, but I never really left. You never really leave the battlefield. The memories stay with you. The faces, the sounds, the smells. They all stay with you. And you learn to live with it. You learn to live with the guilt, the loss, the anger. But you do it because that's what they would have wanted. That's what they fought for. They didn't fight for recognition. They fought for each other. For us. And for this country." He paused once more, looking directly at the camera for the first time. "I've carried their memories all these years, and I always will. But it's time for the world to know who they were. It's time for their stories to be heard." The room was silent for a long moment after he finished. The old man sat back in his chair, his eyes closing as if the weight of the past had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He had told his story, not just for himself, but for the men who had fought beside him, for the ones who had fallen. He had shared his pain, his loss, and his pride. And in doing so, he had made sure their memory would never fade. He had done what he came here to do. He had honored them. And now, finally, he could let go. The old man sat back in his chair, the room now silent except for the faint hum of the lights above him. The camera had been turned off, but his mind continued to churn, processing everything he had just shared. His story, his memories, his comrades, they were all out in the world now, no longer locked away in the confines of his heart. He had given them a voice. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. He had come a long way from the man who had kept his past buried, hidden from everyone, even himself. He had lived in the shadows for so long, carrying the weight of his memories as if they were a burden too heavy to bear. But today, he had let go of that burden. The camera crew had left, and the room was empty, but the old man felt a strange comfort in the solitude. It was as if the silence now held a deeper meaning, a space for reflection and healing. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, feeling the years of service and sacrifice in his bones. But there was no pain in the movement now, only a quiet sense of release. He walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet neighborhood, the world outside still moving, still turning, as if nothing had changed. But he knew that something had changed. Something inside him. Something he hadn't even realized was missing. As he stood there, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he thought about his brothers and sisters in arms. The ones who hadn't made it back. The ones whose stories were never told. He thought about the faces of the men he had lost, the friends who had died beside him. He thought about their families, the ones who had never been given the closure they deserved. And in that moment, he realized that his story wasn't just about him. It was about them. It was about giving them a voice, a place in the world that would remember their sacrifice. They had fought, they had bled, they had died, and they deserved to be remembered. The old man walked over to his desk and opened the notebook again, flipping through the pages he had filled over the past few days. Each word, each sentence, had been a step toward healing, a step toward sharing a piece of himself he had kept hidden for so long. The words had come slowly at first, hesitant and unsure, but now they were pouring out of him with a kind of urgency, as if they had been waiting to be set free. He picked up the pen once more, his hand steady as he wrote the final entry. It was simple, but it felt like the most important thing he had ever written. This is for them. For the ones who never came back. For the ones who fought beside me, and for the ones who still fight today. This story is not mine alone. It belongs to all of us. It belongs to the men and women who have served, who have sacrificed, who have given everything for this country. And it belongs to the ones who never got the chance to tell their story. He set the pen down, feeling the weight of the words settle in his chest. He had done it. He had shared his story, and in doing so, he had ensured that those who had fallen would never be forgotten. The room was quiet again, but now, it felt different. There was no longer a sense of emptiness, no longer a feeling of loss. There was only a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion. The old man walked over to the window again, his eyes now focused on the horizon. The world outside was still turning, still moving forward. But for him, in this moment, everything had stopped. He had honored his brothers. He had shared their story. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. He had carried their memory for so long. But now, he could finally let go. The past was still there, still a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. He could move forward, knowing that their legacy would live on. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the old man smiled softly. He had done what he came here to do. And in that, he found the peace he had been searching for all these years. This emotional story follows a seasoned veteran as he reflects on his past, his sacrifices, and the men he fought beside. After years of silence, he decides to share his experiences, offering an emotional story that touches on loss, brotherhood, and the toll of war. The emotional story takes you on a journey through his memories, from the battles fought to the comrades lost. It explores his inner turmoil, the sense of duty, and the burden of survival. As he writes down his experiences, this emotional story reveals the weight of carrying memories for a lifetime. The old man's decision to finally share his emotional story with the world not only honors his fallen comrades, but also brings a sense of peace to his own life. The emotional story delves into the idea that some stories, especially those of sacrifice and courage, must be told to keep the memory alive. Through his reflections, the veteran finds closure and peace, leaving a legacy of honor and remembrance. This emotional story reminds us of the sacrifices made by those who served and the importance of remembering their stories for generations to come.